On this Wednesday night, the mandatory vaccine policy in Canada. Federal employees told to get their shots if they want to be paid.
Anyone who lies on their attestation will face severe consequences.
Plus, 2 doses will be the ticket to board a plane or train in Canada. Under pressure, doctors and nurses demand an urgent remedy for the COVID-19 healthcare crisis.
I know that, there's a bunch of other families who are going through the same thing we are, and it breaks my heart.
As Alberta patients bear the brunt of cancelled surgeries. How badly is Canada fumbling on its carbon emission goals, and what can be done to get on track? And a killer discovery about killer whales, the little-known orcas hunting big game off BC's coast.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Robin Gill.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. Work and travel plans are about to change for some unvaccinated Canadians. The federal government has revealed details of its new mandatory vaccine policy. Public servants are required to declare their vaccination status by the end of October or be forced to take unpaid leave as early as November 15th. And all travelers 12 and older must be fully vaccinated by October 30th to board planes and trains. The vaccination information will be tracked and audited, and managers can ask for proof at any time. But as Abigail Bimman reports in our top story tonight, the new policy has triggered frustration at one of the country's biggest unions.
Mandatory vaccines for federal employees, a promise launched on the eve of the election campaign. Wednesday, the re-elected Liberals dropped more details.
The bottom line, proof of vaccination will be required by no later than the end of this month for all federal employees.
Public servants have until October 29th to submit an attestation, not actual proof of vaccination. And those who don't
will be placed on administrative leave without pay as early as November 15th.
It doesn't apply to everybody coming into a federal workplace.
The Public Service Alliance of Canada supports a vaccine policy but has concerns, including a lack of consultation.
Sending us a draft document 24 hours before the announcement is made, that's not meaningful consultation. Not at all. So I am terribly disappointed that the Prime Minister didn't follow through on his promise to consult with unions.
These mandates are going to push us to a high enough degree of vaccination that our economy can continue to be open, our kids can continue to go to school.
But will they? The government estimates the new rules apply to 267,000 public service employees, including the RCMP. Plus, they're asking Crown corporations, Canada Post, for example, to mirror the policy and say they're working with federally regulated employers to do the same. That represents another 1 million people. The Chief of the Defence Staff is issuing a vaccine directive Wednesday for all Canadian Armed Forces members. And the second piece, starting October 30th, everyone 12 and up must be fully vaccinated to board a plane or train in Canada, with cruise ship passengers to follow. It's not clear what happens if an employee picks a drawn-out, unpaid leave.
It will probably lead its way into a termination, although it's very interesting that that's not what the federal government said today, but we can certainly read between the lines.
The City of Toronto just announced unpaid suspension will be followed by termination come December 13th for those employees who don't provide proof of vaccination. Nationally, there will be some accommodations made, including on religious or medical grounds.
Exceedingly narrow, specific, and, to be honest, somewhat onerous to obtain.
Actual proof of vaccination, a vaccine passport, remains clunky at best with a patchwork of systems across the country. The Prime Minister continues to promise a national vaccine certificate to make things easier, especially for travel. But Wednesday, Trudeau didn't have any new specifics to share on timing. Robin?
Abigail Bimman in Ottawa. Thanks, Abigail. Healthcare workers say they are under so much strain they're past their breaking points. 2 of Canada's largest medical professional organizations held an emergency summit and say without urgent help from Ottawa, Canadian healthcare will crumble. Jamie Mauracher reports.
The last 19 months have been anything but easy for doctors and nurses inside this Montreal ICU.
We've had a lot of deaths and we've had a lot of young patients die. And it's frankly hard to see these people die.
Add to this staffing and bed shortages.
We scramble and we do our best to try and accommodate every patient.
For almost 2 years, the pandemic has highlighted the ever-growing cracks in Canadian healthcare. In Toronto, these nurses say they are underpaid and overworked.
We cannot carry triple, quadruple workloads and keep you safe.
In Alberta, the ICUs are overflowing. Exhausted physicians have been begging the province for help.
Yes, beds have been opened up, perhaps a monitor's been attached to them, but there are not the staff available to care for those patients.
The federal government has a plan in place to send assistance, but members of the Canadian Medical Association and the Canadian Nurses Association worry Ottawa is ignoring the bigger picture, asking for funding for staff and a federal system to track the shortages.
We have been telling them for years these are issues. We've been working in an environment of austerity, understaffing, inadequate resources. But what we see is instead of politicians actually owning this, governments owning this problem, they bounce the issue back and forth.
Ministry Health says there is more to do, but human resources ultimately is a provincial responsibility. In Quebec, as it begins to enforce its healthcare worker vaccine mandate next week, more staff could be lost.
It's like a wild roller coaster, to be honest. A lot of workers have left.
It's turning to local paramedics to fill the gap, a short-term solution to an unprecedented situation. Jamie Mauracher, Global News, Toronto.
8 critical care nurses from the Canadian Armed Forces are now in Edmonton to help the province fight COVID-19. The number of new daily infections appears to be stabilizing, but intensive care units are still operating at twice their normal size, and it's come at an incredible cost. 8,500 surgeries have been cancelled in Alberta since late August. Yourex-West shows us the toll it's taken.
He's coping okay. Some days are tougher than others.
4-year-old Xavier Mathieu has epilepsy. At 9 months old, he suffered a seizure that nearly cost him his life.
Currently, we're not able to control his epilepsy with medications. So in order to get rid of the seizures, they need to resect 2 parts of his brain. And currently we're waiting for that surgery.
But the preschooler is one of hundreds of pediatric patients to have had their surgeries canceled. And his dad has no idea how long they'll now have to wait.
I understand there are at least 3 other patients who need brain surgery, pediatric patients, who will be ahead of him. It breaks my heart, to be honest, because it's very difficult.
Alberta's punishing 4th wave has forced the cancellation of thousands of surgeries, with every available resource going towards expanding and staffing intensive care beds. Some of these surgeries can be safely delayed, but not for long.
Things that are affecting potentially the lifespan of these patients, right? When we look at things like cancer surgeries, of course, the sooner that's managed, the better the outcome is.
It's why Alberta Health Services says it's trying to do as many urgent operations as possible. And with the number of COVID patients beginning to stabilize, there are plans to soon perform more cancer surgeries as well.
We will continue to be cautious because, as we've said before, it's a fragile balance to ensure we have available ICU beds for anyone who needs one.
More fragile given the time of year. Last fall, Thanksgiving weekend marked the start of Alberta's 2nd wave.
I want people who are unvaccinated to understand that their actions have implications far beyond them, that if they care for their fellow Albertans, they should do the right thing.
Because a surge in cases linked to indoor gatherings this year could be more than Alberta's strained health system can take. Yourex-West, Global News, Calgary.
Today, the Prime Minister publicly addressed his controversial vacation to Tofino, BC on a day to honour Indigenous people.
Traveling on September 30th was a mistake, and I regret it. The first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation was a time for Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people alike to reflect and connect, think about the past, but also focus on the future.
Indigenous leaders slammed Trudeau for spending the day on the beach rather than with residential school survivors. Trudeau had been asked twice to visit the site of the former residential school in Kamloops, where suspected unmarked graves were recently discovered. The Prime Minister says he plans to in the coming weeks. Some news tonight from Elections Canada. The Liberal government has picked up another seat in Quebec. Incumbent Brenda Shanahan will be returning to Parliament after a recount declared her the winner of Châteauguay-Lécole. She beat her Bloc Québécois rival Patrick O'Hara by just 12 votes. This bumps the number of seats held by the Liberals to 159. Just days after being given the position, a senior military officer has been removed from the job. Major General Peter Dawe will no longer be involved in reviewing ways to eliminate sexual misconduct in the Canadian Forces. As our Ottawa Bureau Chief Mercedes Stevenson explains, Dawe was only removed after sexual assault survivors spoke out.
I was stunned and dismayed to see the media reports about this particular role.
Harsh words for the Prime Minister for the country's top brass over the controversial appointment of Major General Peter Dawe, a decision the military reversed late Tuesday night after public backlash.
You said, Mercedes, that it seems as if the leadership just doesn't get it. And I think that's true.
Dawe has been on paid leave since May, after the CBC reported he had written a positive character reference for a convicted sex offender from his regiment. That man sexually assaulted retired Army Captain Annalise Shamoun in her home. Shamoun was blindsided by the decision to bring Dawe back in such a sensitive role.
My first thought was to all of the people who would lose even more hope in the system, that would be so devastated by this decision.
The Vice Chief of the Defence Staff is acknowledging yet another significant misstep. I recognize and apologize for the harm this has caused. The release of this news should have been handled by us with greater care and consideration. But victims groups say even the apology is tone deaf. They were stunned by the military's announcement Dawe would commit to restorative engagement, something they had not agreed to.
Now they've put it onto victims groups to solve it for them.
Shamoun says she's heard nothing from the general.
We don't know where he's at or what work he's done.
Also troubling, the group It's Just 700 says there was no sign in a hastily scheduled meeting on Tuesday that the Vice Chief of the Defence Staff understood the problem with the appointment and that she defended Dawe.
She found that he had done nothing wrong.
The victims group says Allen defended the appointment, saying she followed the military's process. But survivors say it's precisely that kind of blind adherence to a problematic system that is preventing meaningful change. Robin?
Mercedes Stevenson in Ottawa. Thanks, Mercedes. An Ontario teacher has been found not guilty in the death of a student. Nicholas Mills oversaw a school canoe trip to Algonquin Provincial Park in 2017. Prosecutors argued he ignored safety rules and allowed 15-year-old Jeremiah Perry to go in the water without a life jacket. Today, a justice ruled the teacher's actions fell below the reasonable standard of care, but did not constitute criminal negligence. When the Prime Minister announced this country's climate targets in April, climate activists said it wasn't enough. And now a new government-funded study shows Canada is off the mark, which means a recent promise to achieve net zero in 30 years may need some rethinking. Eric Sorensen has been combing through the report.
For a large country with an economy that relies on fossil fuel production, achieving climate targets is still not coming into view, according to a new report. The Trottier Energy Institute suggests that by 2030, Canada is on track to reduce greenhouse gas emissions just 16% below 2005 levels, far short of the target of 40 to 45% set by the Trudeau government this year. To get there, the report says Canada, in part, must transition out of fossil fuel dependency to energy sources that do not emit greenhouse gases, and that we're not doing enough.
We need to have investments in those infrastructures that we don't see yet. We have to reduce our carbon footprint. It's either we plan it properly or we suffer the consequences of not doing so.
The Minister of Environment's office suggests the report's modelling is flawed, that many measures to reduce emissions are not included in the report, measures such as billions of dollars for home and building retrofits and to reduce industrial and vehicle emissions. If little is done, all major sectors will contribute to continuing high emissions. Ottawa is sticking to its target at least 40% below 2005 levels in everything from transportation to energy production to commercial and residential buildings. By 2050, transportation and agriculture will still be net emitters of greenhouse gases, but sectors like electricity, by closing fossil fuel burning plants, reliance on biomass combustion, and direct air carbon capture would balance out and bring Canada to net zero emissions. At least that's the goal. If more is required, the NDP has the votes to help the Liberals pass new climate measures.
We need to make sure that we hit our targets as a country. It is so critical. We are in a climate emergency, and so we are going to be pushing this government to take bold action on the climate crisis.
The Conservatives have set less ambitious targets and say the Liberal promises can't be taken seriously.
They have never made a climate target. They continue to see every year under Mr. Trudeau, our emissions have gone up.
As a major oil-producing country, Canada's commitments will be under intense scrutiny when the next UN Climate Change Summit begins in Glasgow in less than 4 weeks. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
A major milestone in the fight against malaria. Coming up, approval for a shot that could save thousands of lives. Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg is hitting back at the testimony from a whistleblower. The CEO of the social media network says the accusations painted a false picture of the company and claims that Facebook puts profits before people are just not true. A day earlier, in front of the U.S. Senate, former employee Frances Haugen said Facebook routinely made decisions that put business interests ahead of user safety. The World Health Organization is calling it a breakthrough for science, endorsing the first vaccine to prevent malaria. It's been 30 years in the making. About 800,000 kids in Africa received a shot through a pilot program that started 2 years ago. In 2019, nearly 500,000 people died from malaria, mostly in Africa, and more than half were kids 5 and under. When the vaccine was used with anti-malaria drugs, hospitalizations and deaths involving children dropped by 70%. Still ahead, how the pandemic is carving out a new career path for some Canadians. The COVID shutdown allowed a number of Canadians to rethink their jobs, asking questions like, do I have a future in this? And can I go back to school for something else? As Gaviola reports in her Pandemic Pivot series, there are lots of opportunities and a labor force in demand.
Before the pandemic, Maggie DeVito spent 7 years in the restaurant industry, most recently as a bartender in Vancouver's entertainment district. When she was laid off because of COVID, she learned computer coding.
I really fell in love with it and the problem solving of it, and just how big of a world tech is and how much I could help and do other things, and you're constantly learning in it.
She took out a student loan and got a scholarship to a comprehensive coding boot camp. After putting in 80-hour weeks in an intense 3-month training program, she was hired as a web developer, one of the most sought-after positions in tech. She went from making about $20 an hour to $25, and her future earning potential looks pretty good.
Yeah, it's been nice.
Education platform Course Compare reports a big boost in people switching into tech, especially among the underemployed and jobless.
We've seen a significant increase in demand for training in digital skills, with data science, web development, digital marketing, user experience design, and cybersecurity leading the way.
The greatest demand is for shorter courses, offering flexibility as opposed to multi-year degrees. Graduating sooner means getting hired sooner, too.
It's 95% or more of people who secure relevant work within 6 months of graduation, and salaries in the $50,000 to $60,000 range.
The general interest in changing careers and changing jobs has been profound and substantial, especially with the emergence of the tech industry as one of those few industries that really thrived.
Recruiters say there was a shortage of tech workers pre-COVID, but immigrants helped fill that gap, which wasn't the case during the pandemic, creating an even bigger need for these skills.
A career in tech can take you many places. According to Canada's Job Bank, 1 in 4 web developers work for a non-tech firm in finance, retail, and even arts and culture. Anne Gaviola, Global News, Toronto.
The pandemic set off a cleaning frenzy at grocery stores, but a new study shows all that extra disinfection may not be necessary. Scientists from the University of Guelph in Ontario swabbed about 1,000 high contact surfaces in grocery stores and found none of them tested positive for COVID-19. The team began their investigation last year after reports the virus could survive for hours, even days, on surfaces. As long as stores enforce regular sanitization routines and monitor the health of employees, the risk of exposure remains low. Up next, the big game hunters that swam under the radar until now. The whales on the West Coast are riveting, revered, and of course researched. Now, a new study is shining light on a lesser-known variety of killer whales that are being described as the big game hunters of the sea. As Ross Lord tells us, that also makes them ruthless.
Killer whales, or orcas, can be as charismatic as they are powerful. But even though they number roughly 50,000 and are seen and photographed around the world, they can still surprise researchers.
There's been so many studies on them, and it's a shock to me that we're still learning so much about them.
Canadian Josh McInnes teamed with American researchers to study a little-known subset of transient killer whales that roams the Pacific Ocean.
So they're within the same population, but they seem to have a different habitat preferences, more offshore, as well as they seem to, hunt things like gray whale calves or elephant seals.
Got less than 10 feet away from them. Oh, that one was so little.
Unlike some orcas, which can seemingly hug the coastline, he says these animals prefer deep water canyons.